What's up everybody, welcome to Make Things Tiny. My name is Mick and today's video is all about tiny houses, tiny house communities, sustainability, and the future. We're basically trying to answer the question, are tiny house communities an answer to our sustainable future? I'm really excited to share this video with you guys. Before I jump into the video, if you're new to the channel, please do take the time to subscribe. It helps me out a ton. It helps me grow the community. It helps me continue to do what I love, which is create these videos for you guys around tiny houses and all things tiny. The other thing I want to talk about is the shirt that I'm wearing. So we've got merch options for you guys. So this is part of the Use Less collection, which I figured is fitting for today's video on sustainability and tiny houses. So this is Use Less, Live Tiny, Dream Big. You can get it in the merch shop, the Mick Thinks Tiny merch shop. There's a link in the video description. And then last but not least, I want to thank the sponsor for this video. So this video is sponsored by Poplar Tiny Home Village. If you're dreaming of embracing the tiny life, then Poplar Creek Tiny Home Village is the perfect place for you. Nestled in western North Carolina in Rutherford County's scenic landscape, Poplar Creek perfectly blends nature with modern comforts. The community has septic connections, municipal water, 50 amp service, and high-speed internet. You'll have all the conveniences of a traditional home in a sustainable, compact living space. The communal amenities include a fire pit, pavilion, and garden to create a warm sense of community among neighbors. Spread across 10 wooded acres with 30 home sites, you'll be surrounded by nature yet close to the quaint downtowns of Rutherfordton and Forest City. You're also just under an hour away from Asheville, North Carolina, and an hour and a half from Charlotte, North Carolina. For those seeking a lifestyle that values simplicity, community, and environmental consciousness, Poplar Creek Tiny Home Village presents an inviting haven in the heart of western North Carolina. Join others on their journey towards a more fulfilling way of life, where the beauty of nature meets the warmth of human connection. So if you're interested in learning more about Poplar Creek Tiny Home Village, or you want to make that your new home, please do check out the link in the description for this video. You can also check out their Instagram. You can send them a message so you can learn more about the community and hopefully make it your new home. Thank you so much, Poplar Creek Tiny Home Village, for sponsoring this video. All right, so without saying too much more, let's jump right into this conversation about tiny homes and sustainability. Welcome back. So today we're trying to answer the question, are tiny house communities a sustainable option for our future? So it goes without saying that we've got to talk about sustainability. So why we're talking about tiny house communities when I want to talk about sustainability. So I wanted to talk about this because tiny house communities are a really unique way of living. So when I talk about a tiny house community, I'm talking about a plot of land. And then people can roll up their tiny house on wheels on that plot of land. I'm assuming you can put tiny houses on foundation on it too. And you can also like build a tiny house or something like that. But basically it's a community, right? It's a different model for housing. So instead of like your traditional subdivision where you have like 2,000 or 3,000 square foot homes, you would have a bunch of tiny houses in the same area. So that's a tiny house community. Why talk about tiny houses when we're talking about our sustainable future? So there's a couple of reasons. One, we have a housing issue. So I've mentioned this maybe like once or twice before in other videos, but the cost of living and the cost of housing in particular is going up in the United States. So depending on where you live, it can vary. So you still might be able to get a house for 200 to 300K, even though that's still a lot of money. But the overall median family sort of like home price hovers around $400,000. That's a big chunk of change. And if you're living in the western part of the United States, particularly in Southern California, which is where I'm at, I'm in San Diego, it's actually about $1 million on average if you want to buy a house. And I think that's around $200K a year for a family to qualify for a home loan. Most people don't have that much money. Median family income hovers around $70,000. So we have a housing issue. The cost of housing does not match the cost of income and wages that people have. Which brings me into the next point. We have a cost of living issue. So it's actually pretty expensive to live anywhere in the United States at this point in time. So on average, it's about $2,500 a month to live in the United States without kids. So that includes like your rent or your mortgage or utilities, your food, your cell phone bill, you name it. And so that hovers around, we're looking at like 30K take home. So maybe you're looking more at like 40, 45 or 50K before taxes. And depending on where you live, that's not really a viable option either, right? So that's another issue. The other issue is we have a food insecurity issue. So for those of you who aren't aware of food insecurity refers to not being able to pay to feed your entire family or even one member of your household. And surprisingly, 12.8% of US households experienced some form of food insecurity just in the past year alone. So they couldn't feed every single person in their family. So we have that issue. And last but not least, we have a social issue. So we have a social isolation, community-related issue where we have a loneliness epidemic. So a lot of people are depressed. they're isolated. There's a lot of factors that contribute to that. I'm sure the pandemic didn't help with that. So these are some of the issues that I personally think tiny house communities had the ability to address, and all of these relate to the larger issues around sustainability, which is food, environment, climate, housing, and ultimately connection. So why do I think tiny houses have the ability to address this problem? So what I'm going to do to sort of like address this question, or try to come up with an answer for this question with y'all today, is actually just sort of like walk you through different examples of tiny house communities that exist in the US. So we're only going to take a look at 4, and we're just going to talk about the different models, what they offer, and then ultimately I'm going to let you decide whether or not you think tiny houses and tiny house communities in particular are an answer for our sustainable future. So let's jump right into this. So number 1, Tiny Tranquility. Tiny Tranquility I chose because they're an example of what I'm considering a traditional tiny house community model. So for those of you who are not familiar with Tiny Tranquility is kind of like the OG tiny house community. They're off the Central Oregon coast in Waldport, Oregon. They have nightly rentals, they have long-term stays, they have a whole range of community amenities, including a dog park and a greenhouse. They charge about $650 to $700 a month for a 12-month commitment. So those fees would cover like water, sewer, landscaping, a parking spot. So that's not too bad, right? So if you think about whatever your monthly cost is for living right now, if you reduce that down to $650 or $700, or even if you're hovering closer to $1,000, that might reduce your overhead significantly depending on where you live in the US. So that's the traditional model. One person owns the land, a bunch of people roll their tiny houses onto it, and then there's a few short-term rentals. All right, option number 2, which I've talked about before, and they're actually the sponsor for today's video, Poplar Creek. Poplar Creek Tiny Home Village is an example of, I would say, a blend between traditional and modern, because while one person owns the land, they're taking more of a developer's perspective. So they have a plot of land in North Carolina. They offer long-term stays, but they also have a partnership with the builder for those who don't have a tiny house. So if you look at other tiny house communities, most people already have their tiny house and they roll it there. It solves the land issue, right? Because one of the number 1 issues and reasons why people hesitate to buy a tiny house is actually land. It's a pain to find a place to put a tiny house. Like if you live here in San Diego, there's not a lot of spots. And you could have been an RV park, which is maybe less regulated. There's less of a community vibe. So Poplar Creek Tiny Home Village partners with the builder. If you don't have a tiny house, they'll build one for you. You can buy it and then you put it on their property. And they have amenities too. All right, so that's a different model. I don't know if I would say it's kind of like, yeah, again, between traditional and modern. That's what I would say for Poplar Creek Tiny Home Village. All right, so our third option, which for a tiny house community, is South Park Cottages. I've talked about them before. I talked about them in the incredible tiny house companies you should know video. If you haven't checked that video out, check that one out too. South Park Cottages is an example of a more formal real estate development that's sort of taking an interest in microhomes. So this is considered a microhome community. I wouldn't say it's 100% a tiny house community because some of the homes are like larger than a tiny house. So there's range between 330 to 630 square feet. So again, bigger than a traditional tiny house, which has got to be below 500 square feet. But their price range is reasonable. So they go from like $190,000 to $230,000. So if you could imagine getting a brand new place, getting an environment that looks just like a brand new development. So if you ever check them out, links to all of these will be in the description for this video. South Park Cottages looks like kind of like a high-end, kind of like urban chic cul-de-sac sort of thing, right? Like subdivision. So they've got walking pathways and sidewalks and parks and places to sit and green spaces and that sort of thing. So I would say South Park Cottages falls into sort of like the new model for tiny home communities or microhome communities, where you have a real estate developer sort of like developing the land and then you can buy those houses outright and it'll feel more like a traditional neighborhood. It'll just be a smaller spot. And then the last one I want to talk about with you all today is tiny house companies that have bought land and are creating their own villages. So the example for this one is Incredible Tiny Homes. So I haven't talked too much about Incredible Tiny Homes, but they do have their own tiny homes village. So shout out to all the people who have put stuff in the comments about Incredible Tiny Homes and about this specific tiny home village. So yeah, I wanted to make sure I included them in this video. So Incredible Tiny Homes has their own village. They have their own community. It's called The Grove. They've got a 72 lot community, 25 by 40 foot lots, which is kind of massive, right? And they advertise a $200 a month lot rent fee. Now, I don't know what else is included in your overhead if you were to move to the Grove, but all I've got from the information I found online is that it's $200 a month to live there. So overall, all of these are going to offer you an affordable option. So if we're looking at, again, trying to address that question, like, is this an effective option for us when we're looking at sustainability in the future? Let's break it down a little bit. Are they cost effective? Yes, I would say overall tiny houses are cost effective. If you're looking for something that's going to cost you less than $400,000 and it's going to give you that freedom of movement if it's on wheels, just a little bit more sense of freedom and ownership in general, because it's going to be cheaper than your standalone home. Now, if you look at some of my other videos where I talked about tiny houses and tiny house companies, I am well aware that they go above 100K, right? So like you can get a luxury tiny house, something high end, and it pushes like that 200K range. But for the purposes of this video, I want to focus on the ones that are more in that middle range and cheaper. So, 40, 50, 60K. So overall, yes, they're definitely cost effective. And depending on where you live, for me, any of the tiny houses that I've seen are cost effective because I don't want to spend $1 million to buy a house. So even on the higher end, they're cheaper than your traditional house. Are they meeting a need? This is a really big one, right? So we talked about some of those needs in the beginning. Housing crisis. Are they addressing the housing crisis? In a small way, no pun intended, yes, they are, because they're providing an opportunity for people to live affordably. So they are more affordable. So I would say that ticks the box on the housing crisis issue. Are they addressing the issues we have with cities and overpopulation? Yes, because they're taking up less space. So ideally, that's reducing the carbon footprint. It's addressing some of the health effects we have in these densely populated urban areas. We're seeing higher increases of heart disease because things are less walkable, less green space. We're seeing higher instances of asthma in kids and adults because of all of the air pollution with commuting and cars. So tiny houses do address a bit of that. Are they a model for the sustainable future? So just for like the way we live our lives in the future, I would say yes, but let's delve a little bit deeper into what that means. So what do we actually need for a sustainable future? So I'm a bit of I don't know what the word would be called, like global health, community health kind of nerd. So I've looked at the Sustainable Development Goals. For those of you who don't know, that's a big report that's put out every few years where we're kind of like looking at what society can look like. So I think right now we're on like 2030, if I remember correctly. Don't quote me on that though. So yeah, I would check those out if you're interested in stuff like that. So what we need for a sustainable future, a couple of things. We need cleaner air, right? That'll help with reducing pollution. So we need trees to help clean the air. So tiny house communities do encourage more green space. They encourage people to get outside. We need energy efficiency, right? We're not using the resources that we have at our disposal on this planet effectively. So if built properly, tiny houses can be energy efficient. And then again, using solar panels too. Consuming less in general is a big one. Like we need to reduce our meat consumption. We need to reduce just everything that we're consuming so that we can reduce our waste and help take better care of the planet. Tiny house communities, if done, correctly, like in theory, like the ideal tiny house community would address this too, because it encourages resource sharing. We've got community gardens in a lot of them with the greenhouses. So just the community vibe and just sharing less and less private consumption as well too, with the more of a sort of like collective sort of vibe for tiny houses. And also some tiny house communities you can do like co-ops, so like they own the land, so just sharing the land in general and having it be less private too. That's another option as well. And then lastly, supporting rural environments. This is a big one, right? Rural environments don't get a lot of positive press and they're not getting a lot of the benefits of what we're seeing with like remote workers and changes through the pandemic and before the pandemic. So a lot of remote areas are, I don't know if dying is the best word, but they're not being allowed to thrive in the same way that they would be if we were less focused on urbanization. So I think tiny house communities promote rural environments and help support them too, because a lot of these communities are outside of the urban sort of like centers, so that overall can be good for the environment too. So I would say overall tiny houses specifically tiny house communities provide a really solid potential option for us when we're thinking about how to live and thrive sustainably as we continue to consume stuff in the with climate change on the planet and things like that. So we do need to experience more community. We obviously need lower cost of living and more communal spaces and less resource consumption. But I want to know what you guys think. So first of all, thank you so much for watching this. Thank you for sort of like listening to my, I don't know if it's a rant, but just I'm really passionate about this. And I know that a lot of you care about what's going on outside in the world too. And this is just a way to sort of connect tiny houses and tiny house communities to just what's going on in the world around us. So yeah, I want to know what you think. Like, drop a comment. Do you think tiny houses are a sustainable option? Would you live in one? Do you want to buy one? Do you think that they help reduce our carbon footprint or help us in sort of like our fight against sort of like climate change and taking care of the planet? So drop a comment. If you're new to the channel, please do take the time to subscribe. It helps me out so much. It helps me continue to make more videos like this, to do more interviews. I would love to travel and do some like tours with tiny houses and check out some of these communities too. So that's something I want to do in the future. Every time you hit subscribe, it helps with that. Every time you hit like, you comment, you share this with your friends. Please do that. Please share this video with someone you know that's interested in sustainability, and check out the shop so you can get one of these sweet shirts here at the Make Things Tiny shop. Check out that link as well too. And yeah, coming up in future videos, we're just going to talk to more people with tiny house communities and try to get as much information as I can for you guys. So drop a comment, let me know what you want to see, let me know what you think about this video, your thoughts on this topic, and as always, don't forget to think tiny. Thank you so much, guys.